In the early light of a March morning in 1838, a woman stepped naked into a freezing creek, surrounded by 3 enslaved men who stood silent, terrified, and obedient. She spoke to them in a language no one could name. She cut their skin, she took their blood, and every morning after, she did it again. No one in Burke County ever spoke of what happened at Willowbend Plantation, not in church pews, not behind closed doors, not even in confessions before death, because what happened there wasn't just unnatural, it was deliberate, ritualistic, engineered. Cordelia Rutled was not simply a southern plantation wife. She was something else, something colder than steel and sharper than poison. Her life was a mask, her marriage a contract, and her children assets. But here's the part that history choked on. Cordelia didn't just bathe with the men she owned, she studied them, altered them, marked them. 3 men, Isaiah, Caleb, Josiah, each chosen for specific traits, each with a strange crescent birthmark on their left shoulder, each slowly fading into hollow shells of themselves under her daily treatments. When the Savannah investigators arrived a year later, they found 17 deaths, no cause, medical records burned, pages ripped from the county ledger, and in a sealed root cellar beneath the estate, objects no southern lady should have possessed. European surgical instruments, mercury tonics, a black book written in a language older than Latin, but the most disturbing of all, the bindings on that book were made of human skin. Ask yourself, how many plantations had doctors, surgeons, rituals? And what does it mean when a woman who reads medical journals by candlelight starts experimenting on human bodies she legally owns? You were taught slavery was brutality, labor, chains, but they never told you about this, about bloodlines, inheritance, manipulation of will. This wasn't about economics, it was eugenics, a forgotten southern experiment in psychological dissection, spiritual control, and biological precision. This story isn't just about a woman who bathed with her slaves, it's about the creation of a system that never ended. It just changed its uniform. You're already further down the rabbit hole than most men ever go. Now ask yourself, they say Cordelia Rutled never smiled after the age of 19. Not when her children were born, not when she inherited 1,400 acres of prime Georgia land, not even when her husband was lowered into the dirt and the entire county came out to praise her grief. Because grief wasn't what she felt. She had waited for that death, planned for it. Her journals, the ones found later in pieces, water-damaged, burned at the corners, revealed calculations, not confessions. She wrote of traits passed through blood, constitution of the male vessel, and lineal retention of command obedience. What kind of southern wife uses language like that? Cordelia wasn't just a widow, she was a practitioner. And those 3 men, Isaiah, Caleb, Josiah, were not chosen for their labor. They were prototypes. You don't walk naked into a creek in 1838 with 3 enslaved men and perform rituals unless you're operating under a power beyond the rules of your time. This was a woman surrounded by preachers, cotton factors, and Confederate men with pistols on their hips. She didn't care. Why? Because she knew something they didn't, something we were never meant to know. For 22 days after her husband's funeral, she walked to Turkey Creek before dawn and performed the same ritual in frigid water. The nakedness wasn't sexual, it was symbolic, vulnerability as domination. She took the blood from their marked shoulders. She rubbed it on her own skin while chanting from a leather-bound book she called the Codex of Inheritance. It wasn't just mysticism, it was a system. Her method was specific, practiced, and meticulous. 3 men, each genetically similar, each with skills, each light-skinned, each gifted in body and discipline. They weren't just slaves, they were vessels. Do you understand? Cordelia wasn't trying to free herself from society. She was trying to transcend it by rewriting the laws of blood and mind, not through freedom, but possession. And those men, they didn't just become her servants, they became her extensions, Bodies she altered, minds she erased. The other slaves started whispering, "She's working roots. She's pulling spirits from the water. She's draining them, not just in body, but in soul." And yet, no one stopped her. Because fear is a better chain than iron. Something shifted in the men. Isaiah, once the proud carpenter who built stables with his bare hands, stopped looking people in the eye. Caleb, the blacksmith, with arms like pistons and a will like iron, began fumbling tools. Josiah, sharp-eyed, quick-tongued, Thomas Rutled's personal servant, began mumbling to himself in corners, as if speaking to a ghost no one else could see. They didn't just slow down, they faded. Cordelia kept them close, made excuses, assigned them to quiet tasks, told the overseer she needed them for private household matters. But even the house servants could feel the change. They said the three men began to move like marionettes, hollow, obedient, vacant behind the eyes. Men broken by labor still carried rage. Men broken by pain still carried memory. But these three carried nothing, as though Cordelia had carved out their minds and left the shell to walk. And every morning she bathed with them again. Same time, same place, same ritual. She read from her book in that twisted, ancient tongue. She poured fluids onto their skin that smelled like sulfur and crushed violets. She drew their blood again and again, not to kill, but to condition, to alter, to rewrite. It wasn't magic. It wasn't science. It was something older than both. A hybrid of European occultism, southern rootwork, and biological manipulation passed through whispered letters from Charleston, receipts coded in symbols, and medicine bottles with no names. And here's where it gets darker. Cordelia wasn't just bathing with these men. She was implanting ideas, or removing them. Rachel, one of the maids, said she caught Josiah staring at a mirror for over an hour, not grooming, not admiring, just staring, as though trying to remember who he was. And when she asked softly, "Josiah, are you all right?" he turned and said, "I think I used to be." What do you call that? Not trauma, not madness, but identity decay. Cordelia wasn't practicing medicine. She was practicing control, not over flesh, over will. She was testing whether a human being could be stripped drop by drop of everything that made them themselves, and still walk, still obey, still serve. The question is, where did she learn this? And who was she doing it for? Cordelia never acted alone. Behind every mind that learns to dominate, there is another, whispering in the dark. And the deeper investigators dug into the Rutled estate, the more they realized Cordelia was receiving packages regularly from Charleston, wrapped in brown paper, marked only with the initials VD. No return address, no handwriting, just a wax seal, a black circle with a crescent inside, the same mark found on Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah's backs. Inside those parcels, books, not Bibles, not housekeeping guides, but tomes bound in strange leather, thick with diagrams of human anatomy, charts of bloodlines, formulas written in languages long dead. Accompanying them were vials of mercury, white arsenic, and oil-etched surgical razors made not for healing, but for carving open something that doesn't want to be opened. One parcel, discovered decades later behind a bricked-up fireplace at Willowbend, contained a letter. No greeting, no name, just this. The vessels must be stripped of memory before implantation. Do not skip the cleansing. Blood must be drawn where the mark lives. The second stage requires integration via hydrothermic exposure. Do not let them resist. Will must be softened before sealing. These weren't instructions for medicine. They were procedures for reprogramming a human being, and Cordelia followed them like scripture. You see, once you control someone's body, you control their labor. But once you control their memory, their identity, their will. You control their future. This wasn't about bathing, it was about baptism into a new kind of slavery. Not one chained by whip and field, but by confusion, forgetting, ritual, and obedience without thought. Caleb's sister, Miriam, swore he once whispered in his sleep, "She's inside my mind now. I don't know which thoughts are mine." Cordelia wrote in her private journal, "Oh, obedience is not the absence of rebellion, it is the absence of the memory of freedom. And that right there is the architecture of control. Most men think slavery ended with shackles and proclamations. But what if Willowbend was only the beginning? What if the true plantation is internal, a prison built inside the mind, sealed with silence and ritual, where a man obeys not because he must, but because he has forgotten how not to? Most men think evil arrives with a scream. But at Willowbend, evil came quietly, wrapped in silk, wearing gloves, speaking French, smiling with lips that never quite reached the eyes. Cordelia hosted dinner parties throughout 1838. Even as her 3 chosen men deteriorated, she poured wine, laughed softly, and complimented her guests' wardrobes. Burke County's elite sat at her table, clergymen, judges, neighboring planters, and not one of them suspected what she did each morning in that cold, black creek. Because the most dangerous rituals in history don't happen in shadows. They happen in plain sight. Cordelia had mastered the plantation system. But now, she was attempting something darker. A new hierarchy. She was testing whether she could turn men into empty vessels, then fill them with whatever she desired. She wrote in her journal, "If the triangle holds, they will stop resisting by the 33rd day. By then, their language center should degrade. The self detaches. That's when insertion begins." What did she mean by insertion? One theory, found scribbled in the margins of her black book, suggests Cordelia wasn't just trying to erase these men. She was trying to implant another personality, a superior one of her design. Imagine that. Imagine a man stripped of everything that made him unique, then reprogrammed with someone else's identity. Not just his body enslaved, but his mind replaced. Isaiah was seen days later building a new shed, but not in his usual precise way. The measurements were wrong, the corners off. He'd been a carpenter since he was a child, and yet he had to be shown how to use the plane. Again. What happens when a man forgets his own hands, when muscle memory becomes blank? Cordelia didn't mourn the changes. She celebrated them. She wrote, "They are becoming pure, uncluttered, emptied of noise, ready for legacy." Sim, that was the word she used most, because this wasn't about power for power's sake. Cordelia Rutled was building something, a lineage, not by birth, but by selection. She wasn't satisfied with heirs through blood alone. She wanted perfected sons, designed, conditioned, programmed. And these men, Isaiah, Caleb, Josiah, were just the first drafts. Burke County kept quiet, not because they didn't suspect, but because some truths are too terrifying to confront, especially when they wear a woman's face. People whispered behind fans, behind whiskey glasses, behind church pews. They saw the changes in Cordelia's household, the strange light in her eyes, the way her children avoided her gaze, the sudden silence of the 3 men who used to speak freely, laugh loudly, and carry themselves like men who knew who they were. But they said nothing, because Cordelia hosted the best dinners, because her husband had been a commissioner, because the Rutled family owned too much land to be questioned, and because fear is its own religion. Then came the deaths. 17 in total, between March 1838 and September 1839. Some were enslaved workers, some were house servants, 2 were neighbors. All were close to Willowbend. All were healthy until they weren't. No wounds, no signs of illness, just sudden collapse. Their faces frozen in expressions of confusion, eyes wide open, as if they saw something no man should see right before death took them. The county coroner gave vague causes: heart failure, sunstroke, natural decline. But records show something stranger. Every single one of them had interacted with Cordelia within 48 hours of death. A stable boy found her weeping near the smokehouse. A maid claimed Cordelia touched her forehead and muttered something in a language she couldn't understand. A visiting cousin from Charleston saw her sitting in the dining room in total darkness, eyes wide open, hands clasped over a book that pulsed like it was breathing. The cousin was dead within 2 days. That's when Dr. Marcus Hill from Savannah was summoned, not by the county, but by a former Rutled business partner who feared something was infecting the land itself. He arrived under the guise of conducting agricultural surveys. But he brought more than notebooks. He brought measuring instruments not used in medicine. He asked questions about dreams, about memory loss, about the feeling of not being alone in your own body. One of his surviving reports included this sentence: 3 men move like shadows, no will, no hunger, no spark. They obey, but do not live. Cordelia wouldn't speak with him. She refused to open the door. And the next morning, his carriage was found overturned in Turkey Creek, his neck broken, his journal missing. It was ruled an accident. But every man in Burke County who still had instinct left knew better. The 7th ritual changed everything. It was the first time Cordelia bled herself, intentionally, deeply, deliberately. Until then, her body had remained the conductor, not the sacrifice. But on the morning of April 18th, 1838, she entered the creek and did something none of the men expected. She took the razor and carved a crescent shape into her own shoulder, the same place as the men, the same mark they were born with. But she wasn't born with hers, she made it. Blood spilled into the water like ink, cold, bright, controlled. And for the first time, the 3 men reacted. Josiah flinched. Caleb stepped back. Isaiah spoke. "You shouldn't do that." It was the last original sentence he would ever speak. Cordelia turned to him, pale as bone in the morning fog, and whispered, "You don't get to tell me what I shouldn't do. You belong to me, as does your memory, as does your voice." And then she placed her bloody hand over his mouth. What happened in that moment was not physical, it was energetic. Isaiah's body seized, his eyes rolled, he collapsed into the creek like a puppet with its strings cut. When he woke, he could no longer say his own name. She had taken it, just like she had taken his skill, his sense of time, his self. And this is the moment the ritual transformed. It was no longer just experimentation. It became possession. Cordelia's journals from that week are the most deranged of the entire collection. Scrawled handwriting, symbols in the margins, ink stains from shaking hands. One page reads, "Blood carries name, name carries will. Without name, vessel is open. Without blood, door is closed. To cross, I must mark myself. To rule, I must be inside." Inside what, Cordelia? Inside who? Because from that day forward, the 3 men no longer even responded to their own names unless Cordelia spoke them. They followed her silently, waited for her instructions like dogs. A carpenter, a blacksmith, a driver, reduced to shadows. But shadows can still be used. And Cordelia used them to build something. Not a house, not a monument. She used them to build a legacy of silence, a weaponized obedience passed through generations. She was no longer creating workers. She was creating ghosts that obey. What does it take to erase a man? Not kill him, not break him, but to unmake him, mind, will, soul. Cordelia Rutled had discovered the formula. And now, she was scaling it. By late spring of 1838, she was no longer visiting Turkey Creek alone. She began bringing others, select individuals from the plantation's enslaved population, not the strong, not the defiant, but the forgotten, the quiet, the ones whose disappearances would not be noted by neighbors or overseers. They came back different, not whipped, not punished, but blank. Miriam, the same servant who had watched her brother Caleb vanish behind his own eyes, said the new victims began humming strange tunes in their sleep. They spoke languages they had never learned. One young woman was heard whispering, "She's in my mouth. She says words before I do." Cordelia, meanwhile, claimed they were undergoing hydrotherapic rejuvenation. She told the overseer these people had nervous disturbances and were being soothed, but there was no soothing in the way their eyes moved. Twitchy, unfocused, as if looking for something that used to live inside them. And it wasn't just the enslaved who felt it. Cordelia's own children began to change. Margaret, the eldest, stopped speaking for weeks. Catherine took to sleeping in the cellar, afraid of her own mother's footsteps. Even Thomas Jr., the heir, refused to be alone with Cordelia. He reportedly told his tutor, "She watches me while I sleep, not like a mother, like she's waiting for something to come out of me." One evening, Elizabeth, the youngest, was found standing outside in the pouring rain, barefoot, murmuring, "Mama's making new people. She said the old ones had the wrong thoughts." Cordelia denied everything. To guests, to clergy, to relatives. She smiled, hosted teas, quoted Voltaire. But in her locked study, the book grew heavier with each passing day. The Codex of Inheritance, pages soaked with blood, edges burned with wax, margins filled with calculations about blood purity, psychological compliance, and spiritual vacancy thresholds. She was recording results. This was not madness. It was methodology. She was building a blueprint, not for medicine, not for religion, but for a system of control so complete the subject doesn't know they're being controlled. That's not slavery, that's engineering. And history has buried her like myth. Because if you knew what she proved, that the mind can be broken, rewritten, and occupied, you'd start to wonder who around you is real. The human soul has defenses, instinct, memory, pain, identity. These are the locks that keep the door shut, the door that Cordelia wanted open. But every lock has a key, and Cordelia found hers in ritual repetition. Every morning, same hour, same spot in the creek, the same razor, the same phrases from that infernal book, the same washings, the same bloodletting. And then she changed one thing. She began speaking directly into their ears. Not Latin, not English, something older, a language no one taught her. One of the surviving pages from her black journal reads, "They are starting to hear it in their dreams now, the tongue of before, the words that burn the false parts away." Josiah began sleepwalking. He'd be found outside his cabin, barefoot, muttering, "She says I was never born, I was made." Caleb stopped responding to his name entirely. When someone shouted it, he wouldn't even turn. But if Cordelia whispered it, just once, even at a distance, his entire body would freeze like a spell had been cast. This was not hypnosis. This was submission coded into the nervous system. And it went deeper. Because Cordelia wasn't satisfied with obedience. She wanted devotion. A twisted form of loyalty that made them not just follow orders, but need her presence. Rachel, the house servant, swore that one morning she saw Josiah kneeling in front of Cordelia outside the dairy house, weeping and asking her, "Don't leave me in the dark again." And Cordelia, in her cold grey silk, simply touched his forehead and said, "I am the only light you'll ever know." That sentence, recorded by two separate witnesses, appears again in the Codex of Inheritance under a chilling heading, implantation phrase, Cycle 7. She was testing phrases, measuring responses, looking for the exact combination of sound and tone that would collapse the last resistance. Her goal wasn't to create servants. Her goal was to create extensions of herself. No rebellion, no questions, no memories that didn't begin and end with her. And for every man she hollowed out, there was one truth that pulsed louder and louder beneath it all. Cordelia wasn't just trying to control Willowbend. She was preparing for something far bigger. A legacy of obedience, a blueprint for multi-generational possession. The plantation was just the proving ground. The deeper you descend into Cordelia's world, the more one thing becomes undeniable. She did not believe she was doing evil. She believed she was performing a sacred correction. In her private writings, especially in the later pages of the Codex, her tone shifts. It becomes almost messianic. The mistake was letting will run wild, blood without selection, thought without purpose, pain without purification. I was sent to close the door. She wasn't punishing Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. She was purifying them. Removing chaos, sculpting silence, erasing noise from the human soul until only obedience remained. This is how real evil operates. It doesn't snarl. It doesn't foam at the mouth. It rationalizes. It intellectualizes. It wraps itself in higher purpose. Cordelia saw herself not as a mistress of a plantation, but as a keeper of a divine mechanism. And her 3 chosen men? They were not victims in her eyes. They were vessels, chosen for their physical strength, their literacy, their bloodline. Yes, their bloodline. Because buried within a torn page of her journal was a chilling note. 3 lines converge: Drummond, Mercer, Tucker. Traced through mother blood to Virginia, 1791. All marked, all touched. The seal passed through flesh. Cordelia wasn't picking random slaves. She was selecting men born with something in their blood, something old. And if that's true, it means she wasn't the originator of this ritual. She was the inheritor. Some dark seed planted before her. She merely nurtured it, studied it, refined it. And perhaps that's why she bled herself on the 7th ritual, to join the bloodline, to claim ownership not just over their bodies, but their pasts. This is ancient corruption, the kind that moves through families like a sickness, one that speaks in dreams, one that rides inside names and marks and rituals too old to trace. Cordelia didn't invent darkness, she remembered it. And once you remember that kind of power, once it whispers to you through paper and blood and bone, you don't just use it. By the winter of 1838, Willowbend had become a living experiment. But not everyone inside its walls stayed silent. A small group of field hands, mostly elders too old to work heavy crops, began whispering at night. They gathered near the drying sheds, in the thin shadows cast by dying lanterns, speaking low so the overseer wouldn't hear. They weren't talking about escape. They were talking about protection. You see, the South held 2 worlds. The one you could see, plantations, fields, church bells, and the one beneath it, root doctors, conjure women, men and women who kept the old ways alive in whispers, charms, and secret signs cut into wood. At Willowbend, that second world stirred. The elders noticed Cordelia's rituals were not entirely foreign. Parts of them echoed African cosmologies mixed with European folk rites. Words spoken backward, drawn symbols resembling verves, offerings to water spirits, but twisted, corrupted, used not for healing, but for domination. So the elders acted. They made countermarks, buried glass bottles filled with iron nails and salt near the creek, hung charms of red thread under cabins, whispered prayers in Kikongo and Yoruba when Cordelia passed. But even as they worked, their voices dropped lower, their hands shook. They could feel it, a pressure in the air, like a hand pressing on the back of the skull, like an unseen weight making their own memories slip. One elder, Moses, told Miriam, "She ain't just taking them men, she taking the air round us, the thinking round us. If we don't move quick, we gonna forget we ever tried." Miriam didn't forget. She carried her brother Caleb's name like a weapon in her mouth. She started scratching messages into cabin walls, crude warnings for the others. Do not bathe, do not drink, do not look. But Cordelia was already ahead. She had begun adjusting her ritual to counter the elders' charms. She added new steps, burned herbs at different hours, changed the direction of her circles in the creek, and according to one maid, started leaving small bundles of hair and ash under the elders' doorways at night. Those who found the bundles either fell sick or began speaking nonsense within days. By the end of December, Moses himself had forgotten his own daughter's name. The counter-rituals weren't failing because they were weak. They were failing because Cordelia had found a way to erase resistance before it formed, and that made her something far worse than a practitioner of dark rites. By the spring of 1839, Cordelia's influence at Willowbend had become absolute. The three men, Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, were no longer even shadows of themselves. They walked, spoke, and worked as if on autopilot, responding only to her voice. Their memories, identities, and instincts had been stripped piece by piece until they existed solely to execute her will. But Cordelia didn't stop there. She began bringing in the children. Not her own children yet, but the children of her most trusted house servants. She insisted that their morning routines include visits to Turkey Creek, not for labor, not for learning, but for observation, to see obedience in action. The mind must be familiar with submission, she wrote in her journal. Before blood is ever drawn, the seed is planted in their vision. She trained their eyes before she trained their bodies. She forced them to watch the men, watch their own fathers hollowed out, stripped of speech and spark. The children began mimicking the silence, the rigid postures, the obedience without thought. The plantation became a training ground, not for workers but for vessels, for a new generation who would not just obey but accept emptiness as natural. And then came the whispers about the root cellar. Long buried beneath the kitchen house, it was said Cordelia stored her most potent tools there. Vials, razors, journals, herbs, and bottles of unknown fluids. One servant who dared peek claimed the room hummed, vibrated almost, like the air itself had been infused with intent. Blood-soaked rags and leather-bound texts were stacked neatly, pages open to diagrams of human anatomy, annotated with strange symbols, the same crescent marks found on the men. Cordelia's journals began to describe stages of control. Stage 1, obedience. Stage 2, memory suppression. Stage 3, identity realignment. And Stage 4, integration. Integration. The word alone suggests something terrifying, that a human could be rebuilt, filled with something foreign and made to serve another will, another purpose. Cordelia was moving past ritual. She was engineering consciousness itself, and she was patient, so terrifyingly patient. For those around her, she appeared the picture of a refined southern widow, quiet, meticulous, socially polished. But under that mask, she was dismantling souls one morning at a time, and by the time anyone noticed, it would be too late to resist, because real control doesn't announce itself. It seeps, it takes root, it becomes normal. And by the end of that spring, Willowbend was no longer just a plantation. It had become a laboratory of obedience. By midsummer 1839, the air at Willowbend was thick with heat and silence. Not the normal hush of a southern plantation, but a charged stillness, like a stage before the curtain rises. Something was happening beneath the surface, and everyone felt it. The enslaved workers whispered at night, but even their whispers were thin, brittle. They knew Cordelia was taking something from the men, and they feared she would soon take it from them. But fear is a binding agent. It seals lips and keeps bodies still. And Cordelia understood this better than any preacher or overseer. She began to expand her ritual. The morning gatherings at Turkey Creek grew longer. Sometimes she kept Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah submerged for extended periods, their bodies trembling in the icy current as she chanted from her leather-bound book. She added new elements to the process: ashes mixed with lye, mercury tinctures, strange black seeds she burned into powder and rubbed into their wounds. She wasn't just conducting some private ritual. She was testing variables, altering conditions, recording outcomes. Her journal entries became more clinical, more like laboratory notes than personal reflections. Specimen I shows diminished will but retains physical strength. Specimen 2 shows increasing passivity but reduced motor coordination. Specimen 3 shows partial memory erasure, requires deeper incision and longer immersion. To Cordelia, these men weren't men at all anymore. They were experiments, living diagrams of what she believed she could shape, the will itself. And then, for the first time, Cordelia began to use their obedience. She would whisper commands in that low, deliberate voice, commands they would never have obeyed before, like staying awake 3 nights in a row without food, or holding their arms out for hours until muscles tore. She drove them past exhaustion, past self-preservation, watching to see if the mind's natural survival instinct would fight back. It never did. At night, she sat alone at her desk, her pale fingers smudged with ink and ash, sketching diagrams of triangles, circles, crescent moons over human silhouettes. The leather-bound book never left her side. Even her children had begun to keep their distance, whispering among themselves about the smell of chemicals on her clothes and the way she stared at them as though they, too, were material for her designs. This was no longer the story of a widow managing a plantation. It was the story of a blueprint for control, a blueprint meant to be scaled. And Cordelia's eyes were already looking beyond Willowbend. By late summer 1839, something had shifted. The men, Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, had become almost entirely unrecognizable. Their eyes no longer reflected thought, only the faint echo of a command waiting to arrive. Their voices had diminished to monosyllables when Cordelia permitted it. Their movements, precise and automatic, had become extensions of her will. But this perfection came at a cost, a subtle, creeping corruption in the air itself. Neighbors began noticing that Willowbend smelled different, not foul, not overtly decayed, but off, sweet, metallic, a trace of rot blended with something chemical. Children passing nearby said the creek looked black in the morning light, though when adults came to investigate, the water appeared normal. A hound died suddenly near the stables, and even the plantation horses shied from the main house. Inside, Cordelia's journals became fevered, frantic. She described new stages. Stage 5, dissociation of self from surroundings. Stage 6, emotional attenuation. Stage 7, integration of consciousness. She was speaking in codes she understood, fragments of a language she had pieced together from her European correspondences, African ritual knowledge, and the observation of human nature itself. And then, the first outright horror. One morning, Rachel, the house servant, found Josiah standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at the wall, his hands smeared with blood. But no one had been injured. The blood was his own, thin, dark, almost syrupy. He had cut shallow lines across the same crescent-shaped mark on his left shoulder, the ritual scar that had first been his birthmark. When Miriam tried to pull him away, he whispered, or perhaps it was Cordelia's voice through him, "I am empty. She told me to be empty. I obey." And that's when Rachel realized the unthinkable. Cordelia had succeeded beyond her origin. Plan. She wasn't merely creating obedient men, she was splitting them, separating body from will, flesh from self. Isaiah had begun sleepwalking, performing tasks he could no longer recall. Caleb stopped speaking entirely. Josiah was the first to show signs of internal resistance, but the resistance had no voice, no memory, only movement, twitching hands, convulsing in subtle rebellion that vanished when Cordelia's presence returned. The plantation, once a place of wealth and order, had become a laboratory of mind control and psychological disassembly. The line between science, magic, and horror blurred completely. And Cordelia, she observed it all with the calm, calculating eyes of someone who already knew the outcome. This was not madness. This was design. Autumn 1839 arrived, and the air at Willowbend carried the chill of inevitability. Cordelia's morning rituals had evolved into a full-scale assault on the mind. The men were no longer just obedient. They were erased. Their eyes, once bright with thought, were now reflective pools of silence. When she spoke, their bodies moved as if pulled by invisible strings. When she gestured, they followed as though her will alone dictated gravity. The creek became an altar, the water a conduit. Each day, the temperature of the water, the position of the sun, even the rhythm of her incantations changed, calibrated to exact measurements she meticulously recorded in her black journal. She introduced new liquids, oils that burned, powders that tingled across skin, and tinctures whose scents brought fleeting visions. She cut them strategically, only on the crescent mark that connected them all. Blood mingled with water, and as it dripped, it carried something unseen, a transference of authority, a siphoning of identity. It was no longer enough to make them obedient. She was reconstructing them, hollowing one part and filling it with another. Isaiah's hands, once skilled as a carpenter, trembled with precision, yet lacked understanding. Caleb's muscles, immense and powerful, moved with perfect strength, but without initiative. Josiah wandered the grounds like a shadow of himself, eyes staring, waiting for the next command, and the subtle, almost imperceptible aura around them grew heavier each day, a presence that the other slaves could sense but could not name. The plantation itself seemed to absorb this terror. Animals refused to enter the main house. The riverbank at Turkey Creek grew dark with the impression of the rituals, and even the trees seemed to lean away. One morning, Cordelia spoke to the three men in the creek. Her voice, low and commanding, carried a sentence meant to cement their final transformation. Today, you are not yourselves. You exist only to serve. You have no past. You have no thought. You belong to me. The words were simple, but they cut deeper than steel. When the men emerged from the water, their bodies were still, their minds empty, and yet, in that emptiness, Cordelia found power, absolute, undeniable power. This was no longer a ritual. This was dominion over consciousness itself. The ritual had become the ultimate truth at Willowbend. The mind can be erased, rewritten, and possessed. And those who observed it silently, the house servants, the children, the elders hiding in the shadows, understood a terrifying reality. Cordelia Rutled had crossed a line no one had ever crossed before. By October 1839, the ripple of Cordelia's influence had spread beyond Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. The men had become instruments, extensions of her will, but now their presence alone began to affect the plantation. The other enslaved workers moved differently around them, quieter, hesitant, as if the air itself had shifted. They whispered in hushed tones about shadows that weren't theirs, feeling eyes where no one stood. Cordelia's children began exhibiting changes as well. Margaret, once lively and demanding, now spoke only when spoken to, her gaze fixed on the floor. Catherine trembled if Cordelia left the room. Even young Elizabeth, the smallest, was already mimicking the silence, the rigid postures, the hollow obedience she saw in the three men. The next generation was being conditioned in the same unseen chains. And it was the little things that revealed the depth of her control. Workers reported seeing the three men staring at empty walls for minutes on end, then suddenly moving with purpose, performing tasks they hadn't been assigned. One house servant noticed Caleb standing motionless by the fire, as if listening to instructions no one could hear. When she approached him, he blinked slowly, turned, and continued as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't just obedience. It was fear made internal. Those who resisted mentally or emotionally found themselves unable to sleep, unable to eat. trapped in a state of heightened awareness that made every sound, every movement, every breath feel like judgment. Cordelia's rituals had begun to invade the minds of the entire household. The three men acted as conduits. Their hollowed-out presence carried the imprint of Cordelia's control into the surrounding air. The house itself seemed to hum with it. Even the river at Turkey Creek reflected the change. The water darkened as if absorbing some of the energy, a subtle pulse that no one dared explain. And yet, she still went further. Cordelia began incorporating the servants into the morning routines at Turkey Creek. Not all at once, but in small increments. First observation, then participation. Little by little, the same rituals, washing, bloodletting, phrases from the Codex, were introduced, and the transformation spread, not physical, not overt, but internal, minds bending, reshaping, aligning to a single will. By this point, Willowbend was no longer a plantation. It was a living crucible, a place where human identity could be dissected, rewritten, and controlled with terrifying precision. And in every glance Cordelia cast, in every measured movement, one thought became clear to anyone watching too closely. She had become the epicenter of everything that could be stolen from a man, his will, his memory, his very self. By November 1839, the first irreversible consequences began to appear. It started subtly, a misstep in the fields, a hesitation in speech. But soon, the effects of Cordelia's morning rituals became impossible to ignore. Isaiah, once the meticulous head carpenter, attempted a simple repair on a barn door and could not recall the steps. The tools in his hands felt foreign, as if he had never touched them before. Caleb, the blacksmith, hammered nails with perfect rhythm, but without judgment or adaptation. A machine repeating learned motions without understanding. Josiah, the driver, wandered the rows of cotton with his eyes vacant, unable to recognize his own reflection in the water barrels. Observers whispered that the men were alive but absent, present in body, absent in mind. Rachel described it as seeing the ghost of a man where a man once was, and this ghostly obedience was contagious. Other enslaved workers, especially those forced to participate in smaller versions of the Creek ritual, began exhibiting signs of mental fog, sudden lapses in memory, and a nervous fear that was almost spiritual in nature. Cordelia, meanwhile, recorded it all. Every slip, every hesitation, every sign of compliance or resistance was logged in the margins of her journals. She made notes about blood flow, time of day, body temperature, and even the subtle tonal shifts in voice during her chants. Her language had grown clinical and precise, but the purpose remained the same: absolute dominion over mind and body. One chilling entry reads, Stage 8. Observation confirms partial collapse of free will. Stage 9. Identity transfer pending. Stage 10. Integration into system complete. Observe next cycle carefully. And the horrors weren't limited to behavior. Physical changes began to manifest. Isaiah's shoulders sagged unnaturally. Caleb's skin took on a waxy pallor. Josiah's eyes, as once sharp, appeared cloudy, almost reflective, like glass covering a fading flame. These weren't illnesses, they were signs of control taking root, of human essence being rewritten. The plantation itself seemed complicit. Even the environment reflected the unnatural hierarchy. Trees bent subtly along her path. Shadows lengthened unnaturally around the creek. Animals became skittish, avoiding areas where the rituals were performed. The land itself had absorbed a resonance of dominance, fear, and blood. By this point it was clear, Cordelia Rutled had not merely created obedience, she had created dependency at the cellular and psychological level. Those subjected to her rituals could no longer survive without them, without her presence, without her commands, without her manipulation. And the most terrifying truth lingered in the background. She was not finished. By December 1839, the horrors of Willowbend began to whisper beyond its gates. Travelers, merchants, and neighboring planters started noticing oddities. Men sent to deliver messages or bring goods reported strange behaviors from the enslaved men who now seemed part human, part automaton. Caleb's blacksmith shop, once bustling with precise hammering and lively conversation, was eerily quiet. Tools were left mid-task, nails bent, horseshoes poorly fitted. It was as though the hands that had once mastered fire and iron no longer remembered their own strength. Even more disturbing were the rumors of sounds, voices murmuring late at night, phrases that didn't belong to any language the locals knew. Servants whispered about seeing shadows move independently of the men. Children of neighboring plantations claimed to see figures at the edge of the woods, standing silently by Turkey Creek, staring at the moon with eyes too hollow for a living soul. Cordelia, of course, appeared outwardly untouched. She hosted guests with the poise of a southern matron, conversed in perfect civility, and displayed a calm elegance that concealed the full extent of her operations. No one could suspect the horror she orchestrated daily at the creek, beneath the rising mist of dawn. But those closest to the plantation, the house servants, the few elders still attempting minor resistance, and her own children, were changing too. They no longer moved spontaneously. They mimicked her tone and gestures, often unconsciously. Whispered instructions or gestures from Cordelia's shadowed study could bend their movements before a word was even spoken. Fear had become obedience. And then the first real cracks appeared. One neighboring overseer reported seeing Caleb standing by the forge at midnight, staring at the fire as if hypnotized. When questioned, Caleb said only, "She will make all correct. Ways are empty. We are right." The phrase, delivered with the calm of absolute belief, struck the overseer like a physical blow. He left Willowbend trembling, convinced he had encountered something beyond comprehension. Cordelia, in her journals, called these responses proof of integration. She was testing the limits of human perception and memory, recording subtle shifts in obedience, timing, and psychological surrender. She wasn't just exercising power over individuals, she was creating a pattern of control that could theoretically extend indefinitely. By this point, Willowbend had become more than a plantation. It was a psychological engine, a place where identity could be erased, rewritten, and disciplined like clay, and the outside world, though unaware, was beginning to feel the first tremors of that darkness. Every day that passed, the legend of the plantation grew in hushed tones. People didn't know what to call it, but one thing was clear: something unnatural was happening there, and it could never be undone. By early 1840, the reach of Cordelia's rituals had begun to touch her own children. Margaret, Catherine, Thomas Jr., and little Elizabeth no longer spoke freely. Their voices were measured, clipped, carefully observed. Every gesture, every glance, every thought was unconsciously filtered through the lens of Cordelia's will. Even their laughter became rare, carefully moderated, as if the joy itself might betray secrets too dangerous to release. Cordelia was no longer merely a mistress or ritualist. She had become a matriarch of control, shaping the next generation to continue her work. Her journals, now filled with meticulous diagrams and coded phrases, described the process. Children must witness. Children must internalize. They must see obedience before they can feel it. The seed of authority planted in the young is stronger than fear in the old. Her mornings at Turkey Creek now included observation sessions. The children were instructed to watch the rituals silently, without commentary. The men, Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, stood in the water, obedient and hollow, performing the ablutions and bloodletting, while the children absorbed every motion, every word, every command. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was indoctrination on a cellular level. Cordelia was teaching them that submission, fear, and ritualized obedience were natural states of being, that the human mind could be bent, erased, and replaced, and that she was the ultimate authority. Even her correspondence from Charleston hinted at obsession. She described plans to codify her methods, to write a manual, to preserve the knowledge of control and pass it down. The psychological damage to her children was insidious. Margaret became excessively meticulous, repeating small tasks endlessly, as if perfection could prevent chaos. Catherine developed sudden bursts of terror when confronted with min or disorder. Thomas Jr., normally energetic and curious, withdrew, spending hours staring at the floor, tracing the patterns of the floorboards with his gaze. Elizabeth, the youngest, began to mimic the men's hollow obedience, moving silently, always careful not to attract attention. Cordelia was molding more than servants or protégés. She was molding extensions of herself, future carriers of her dark methodology, and in doing so she blurred the line between family and laboratory. The children were both heirs and experiments. By now, the mansion itself felt alive, as though it were a sentient witness to the unfolding transformation. The servants moved like shadows, the walls absorbed whispers, and the river at Turkey Creek reflected the unnatural rhythm of ritual and dominance that had seeped into every corner of Willowbend. It was clear. Cordelia Rutled had become the axis around which the minds of Willowbend revolved. And once a mind revolved around her, it could never truly escape. By the winter of 1840, the men, Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, had crossed a threshold from obedience into permanent alteration. No longer merely hollowed out, they now moved as though the essence of their being had been replaced. When Isaiah attempted to carve wood, the motions were flawless but devoid of intention. Caleb could strike iron with perfect timing, yet he seemed unaware of the craft itself. Josiah wandered the fields, repeating phrases from Cordelia's chants under his breath, his eyes clouded with the haze of someone trapped between worlds. Even those who had resisted her influence, the elders, Rachel, Miriam, began to notice phenomena they could not explain. Shadows moved independently, objects shifted subtly when no one was near. Water at Turkey Creek seemed to pulse, dark and cold, as if echoing the rituals. Some swore the men's hollow gazes carried a presence beyond human comprehension, a faint but undeniable intelligence that was not theirs. Cordelia's journal hinted at something more. Words she had previously written with meticulous scientific precision now teetered on the edge of the arcane. Stage 12, the vessel accepts. Stage 13, the vessel whispers. Stage 14, the vessel returns. Observation of the unknown proceeds. Do not falter. The unknown she referenced was never fully explained, but in the testimonies recovered years later, servants recalled faint chanting from the creek long after dawn, rhythmic phrases that no one alive had ever heard before. The air would thicken, muscles would twitch in involuntary convulsions, birds would fall from trees, and the men, already shadows of themselves, would speak in tongues not their own, sometimes muttering fragments of Latin, sometimes syllables with no origin they recognized. The transformation was irreversible. Each morning's ritual left an imprint deeper than the last, an invisibly architecture of control written into flesh, blood, and mind. What Cordelia had created was no longer obedience, it was possession, a merging of will, blood, and consciousness. At Willowbend, the air carried a subtle hum, a resonance that filled every room, every corridor, every cabin. It was the imprint of dominance made physical, and anyone who lingered too long near the creek reported nausea, dizziness, a creeping sense of being watched, judged, and measured. By now, the plantation had become something more than human, a place where thought, memory, and identity could be rewritten, where submission became survival, and where the line between natural and unnatural had long since vanished. Cordelia had crossed the ultimate boundary. She had turned men into vessels. And the worst part? She was still learning. By the spring of 1840, cracks began to appear in Cordelia's carefully constructed order. Isaiah, the first to be hollowed, started showing fleeting signs of awareness, small gestures, almost imperceptible, a pause before obeying, a hesitation in his step, a fleeting glance at the sky as though remembering something lost. Caleb, too, began murmuring fragments of thought that didn't belong to Cordelia's design, tiny sparks of rebellion that vanished when her voice commanded attention. Josiah remained the most compliant, but even he occasionally twitched, as if a distant part of himself resisted. The plantation servants noticed these anomalies with growing dread. Rachel described seeing Isaiah pause mid-task and stare at her as though he recognized her, though no words passed his lips. The air around the men seemed heavier, charged with the tension between control and residual consciousness. Cordelia, ever meticulous, recorded these developments in her journals. She described the phenomenon clinically. Minor resistance detected, must increase immersion, must recalibrate liquids, must reinforce the rhythm. Will is fragmented, integration incomplete. Observation continues. It was a subtle acknowledgement that even her most complete experiments were not absolute, and this tiny flaw carried enormous consequences. One morning at Turkey Creek, Cordelia's ritual took an unexpected turn. Isaiah's hands trembled while holding the water. Caleb's head tilted unnaturally, and his voice, for a brief moment, broke rhythm with her chant. Josiah's lips moved in silent mutiny, reciting a phrase that wasn't part of her instructions. Cordelia's reaction was both methodical and terrifying. She did not panic. She adjusted, recalibrated, and pressed forward. But the seed had been planted. Obedience was not infinite. The first documented act of defiance had emerged, subtle, almost invisible to an untrained eye. And it was terrifying, because it demonstrated that even absolute control could be challenged. Outside observers, had they known, would have been astounded. The plantation, long thought to be merely a site of cruelty and domination, had become a battlefield for consciousness itself. The men, once fully obedient, were now battlegrounds between Cordelia's will and their own fractured selves. And in that tension, the horror intensified. Resistance did not just threaten Cordelia's system, it introduced instability into the very fabric of the plantation's unnatural order. The question now loomed, could her methods survive defiance? Or had she, in creating vessels of obedience, inadvertently created the seeds of her own undoing? By midsummer 1840, the tension at Willowbend had reached a critical point. The subtle acts of resistance by Isaiah and Caleb no longer remained hidden. The other servants began to notice irregularities. The hollowed men sometimes paused mid-task, their gazes lingering too long on certain objects or people. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally when they did. Some whispered that the men looked like two people at once, one present in flesh, the other in the grasp of Cordelia's control. Cordelia, of course, noticed immediately. Her journals reflected a duality, fascination and cold calculation. She increased the intensity of the rituals, extending immersion in the icy creek, adding new liquids to the ablutions, and cutting deeper into the crescent birthmarks, mixing blood with mercury and herbs she claimed could bind will permanently. But something else had begun to manifest, something she could not entirely control. Objects moved inexplicably. A basin would tip over without touch, a chair would slide across the floor, the water of the creek sometimes swirled even when calm. Witnesses later described hearing whispers, not from the men, but from the air itself, subtle voices that echoed fragments of Cordelia's chants back at the plantation. And the men themselves began exhibiting behaviors that defied explanation. Isaiah, while performing a routine carpentry task, muttered lines from the ritual book in a voice that wasn't his own. Caleb's reflection in the creek water occasionally appeared distorted, showing a face older and hollow, almost spectral. Josiah once screamed in the middle of the night, waking the children, but the words that left him were unintelligible, like a corrupted language of control. Even the children were affected. Margaret and Catherine began sleepwalking, tracing the creek's edge in silent mimicry of the rituals. Elizabeth, barely 9, spent hours at the windows staring at the men, whispering phrases she didn't understand, but that echoed the ritual's cadence. Cordelia, ever observant, noted each occurrence in her journal, recording the unexpected resonance as data, a complication, but also proof that the system could expand beyond the initial subjects. The plantation had evolved into a psychological ecosystem, a place where human consciousness, fear, and dominance intertwined. It was no longer merely a series of rituals, it was a living, breathing entity, and Cordelia Rutled was both its architect and its heartbeat. By this point, anyone stepping onto Willowbend could sense the impossible weight of control, a pressure that pressed against thought itself, bending perception and reality. Even those who had never witnessed the creek rituals felt it. And yet, in the heart of it all, Cordelia remained calm, her grey eyes glinting with the knowledge that she had created something that no law, no man, and perhaps no God could touch. By late 1840, the physical and psychological decay of Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah could no longer be denied. Isaiah's skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent hue. The lines of his face had deepened unnaturally, as though the life beneath them had been drained. His hands, once capable and strong, trembled with the slightest movement, yet when Cordelia commanded, they performed impossible tasks with mechanical precision, as if his muscles had forgotten the concept of voluntary action. Caleb the blacksmith displayed an eerily similar transformation. His body remained powerful, but his awareness had been stripped to a single thread: obedience. He moved through the forge like a ghost, hammering iron with perfect technique but no comprehension. Any deviation from Cordelia's ritual or rhythm caused him subtle convulsions, brief tremors that suggested his mind was fraying under the strain of forced submission. Josiah, once the most compliant, began exhibiting moments of violent disorientation. In the dead of night, servants reported seeing him wander aimlessly, muttering phrases in a language none could understand. Occasionally, he would collapse by the riverbank, clutching his head as if battling unseen forces, then rise minutes later, perfectly calm, ready to obey. It was a rhythm of possession and recovery, like a tide that drained and refilled him daily. The plantation's animals seemed to sense the unnatural state of the men. Horses shied away from them, dogs refused proximity, even livestock grew restless, their eyes wide and unblinking. The trees along Turkey Creek whispered in the wind, carrying a chill that seemed unnatural for the season. Everything at Willowbend had absorbed the residue of the rituals, fear, control, and the slow erosion of identity. Cordelia's children mirrored the decay in subtler ways. Margaret and Catherine's movements were stiff and calculated. Elizabeth's eyes, wide with curiosity, carried a hollow vigilance far beyond her age. All had absorbed the invisible imprint of the rituals, becoming extensions of the system even without direct participation. Cordelia, ever meticulous, recorded these developments with clinical detachment. She described it as the natural progression of integration. But for anyone observing from outside the strict hierarchy of her control, it was horrifying. This decay was not simply physical or mental, it was existential, a gradual erasure of the self. The men were no longer men. They were vessels, hollowed and filled with a version of life dictated entirely by another. And in that erasure, the true horror of Willowbend became apparent. Cordelia Rutled had discovered the mechanics of human submission, and she had weaponized it with terrifying precision. In the fall of 1840, a stranger came to Willowbend. Dr. Edmund Langley, a respected physician from Augusta, had heard rumors circulating about the plantation. Word had spread in local circles of the strange illness that had plagued Thomas Rutled before his death, the unsolved mystery of the multiple deaths among the enslaved population, and now the increasingly odd behavior of the Rutled family and their household. Dr. Langley was not a man of superstition or folklore. He was a scholar, trained in the medical sciences and dedicated to rationality. But something about the Rutleds' peculiar history gnawed at him. He had received a private letter from an old colleague in Savannah, warning him about the unnatural influence Willowbend seemed to wield on its inhabitants. Langley, intrigued but skeptical, decided to make the long journey to Burke County. He arrived on a misty morning, a chill hanging in the air. As he rode towards Willowbend, he noticed the plantation was unusually quiet. The roads were pristine, the fields lush with cotton, but there was an unnatural stillness. No voices called from the fields, no birds sang from the trees. It was as though the land itself held its breath. Upon his arrival, Cordelia greeted him with her usual cold grace, her grey eyes appraising him with an unsettling precision. She was polite, composed, but there was a thinly veiled something else in her gaze, something far too knowing. Dr. Langley was shown to the main house, where the staff moved like silent shadows, avoiding eye contact, and the children remained eerily quiet, their movements stiff and controlled. As he settled in, Cordelia invited him to dine with the family that evening. The dinner was formal, the conversation rigid and devoid of warmth. Thomas Rutled's absence was noted only once, when Cordelia briefly mentioned his death in a tone so matter-of-fact it chilled Langley to the bone. The food was fine, though Langley's stomach felt heavy, as though something was wrong with the very air. He asked Cordelia about her husband's death, and she described it in a clinical manner, speaking of it as though it were simply a matter of medical inevitability. But when he probed deeper, asking about the deaths of the enslaved workers, she grew distant, her smile tightening. At the evening's end, Langley retired to his room, but the oddness of the place gnawed at him. The silence, the way the walls seemed to absorb sound, the way the air itself felt thick, as if it were charged with an unseen force. He couldn't sleep. Around midnight he wandered the house, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had settled over him. The halls were long, dark, and oppressive, the wood creaking underfoot like something alive. He found himself standing before the old cellar door, the one Cordelia had always kept locked. His curiosity, once the mark of a trained mind, now pushed him toward something deeper, something his intellect could not explain. He descended into the cellar, the air damp and cold, the scent of mildew and rot hanging in the air. There, in the flickering candlelight, he saw the sealed box Cordelia had hidden, along with the odd, ritualistic items she had accumulated over the years. A book, a collection of symbols Langley didn't recognize, lay open on a desk. The pages, aged but well-maintained, seemed to hum faintly, as though alive. He flipped through it, only to freeze at a particular passage. To bind the mind, sever the soul. The ritual of dominance is complete when the will is no longer the master of the body. All that remains is the vessel. The words burned into his mind, and an unsettling realization began to crawl through his thoughts. This was no ordinary plantation. What Cordelia had done, what she had learned, was not merely medical, not merely psychological. It was something far darker. He hurried back upstairs, the weight of the book still pressing on his conscience. But as he reached the landing, he felt Dr. Langley's departure from Willowbend was swift, a silent retreat into the early morning mist. But his visit would not be forgotten, nor would the questions he had posed. Cordelia Rutled did not miss a thing. When she discovered Langley's absence by the time the sun was high, she moved without urgency, but with unmistakable purpose. Her hands trembled for a brief second, an anomaly in her otherwise unshakable composure. The doctor's questions, his doubt, had pried open a crack in her perfect system. And cracks, she knew, meant the start of unraveling. She ordered Josiah, Caleb, and Isaiah to gather. But something had shifted in their behavior since Langley's visit. They moved like bodies of a forgotten past, mechanically responding. But their eyes, those distant, haunted eyes, seemed to stare beyond her, as though they no longer saw her as their master. Isaiah the carpenter stood first, as though he was about to speak. He opened his mouth, but no words came. It was as if something in him knew it was no longer within his power to speak freely. Cordelia could feel the shift in the air, the tightening grip of something that, despite her meticulous control, was beginning to slip. She turned to Caleb, who stood stiffly by the forge, his once towering presence now shrouded in an eerie stillness. His gaze never met hers, but there was something unspoken in the air between them, something she could no longer command. Josiah, the most compliant of them all, had been standing silently since Langley's departure, but now he was staring at the empty doorway with an unsettling fixation, as if waiting. It was then that Cordelia realized the men were beginning to break free, piece by piece, from the control she had so carefully wielded. Desperately, she returned to her journals, flipping through pages filled with rituals and formulas, seeking something she had missed. Her last note from the previous night, the last calculation for total immersion, now seemed like a distant memory, a failed formula. The energy had changed. The ritual, once perfect, was now buckling under pressure. Cordelia's worst fear had always been the collapse of her system, the loss of her grip. Langley had been the catalyst, but the true danger lay in the residual power that remained in the men, and as she turned the page in her journal, she saw it. The vessel, once broken, may find its way back to the source. Disintegration is the path to restoration. It was a reminder she had written years ago, before the rituals had truly begun. The vessel could always return to the source, but what if it returned wrong? At that very moment, she heard a noise from the fields, a sharp, jagged cry that carried through the morning air. It was Isaiah. Cordelia rushed to the windows, and what she saw froze her heart in its chest. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah had gone to the creek, but not for the morning ritual. They were standing in the shallow water, staring at the sky, their eyes wide and unblinking. The creek itself seemed to pulse, the water rippling in unnatural waves, as if the land itself was alive. Isaiah's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound emerged. Caleb's massive frame was trembling, his body slick with sweat. Josiah stood with his hands raised, as if reaching for something above, something unseen. And then, in that frozen moment of silence, something else happened. The air thickened, the ground beneath her feet hummed, and Cordelia felt a cold, suffocating pressure on her chest. The men's eyes locked onto her, and for the first time, they saw her. She had made them vessels, but now they were becoming something else, something beyond her control. Her world tilted. The ritual that had bound them was unraveling, and in its place, a something darker, more primal, was awakening. She could no longer determine if it was the men who were broken, or if she herself was. And that was the terrifying realization: she had created something.